The desert wind carried the taste of dust and dying grass across the vast expanse of the Arizona Territory. It was the summer of 1887, and the land seemed to shimmer under the relentless sun, creating mirages that danced between the red rock formations jutting from the earth like ancient sentinels. The sky stretched endlessly, a pale blue canvas streaked with wisps of clouds that offered no promise of rain. In the distance, the San Francisco peaks rose majestically, their tops still holding patches of snow despite the scorching heat below. Sagebrush dotted the landscape, their silver-green leaves rustling in the hot breeze, while occasional mesquite trees provided meager patches of shade for the lizards and jackrabbits that called this harsh land home. The frontier town of Bitter Creek wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered wooden buildings huddled together as if seeking protection from the vast emptiness surrounding them. The main street was little more than a wide dirt road, rutted from wagon wheels and baked hard by the sun. On market days, however, the town came alive with a peculiar energy, drawing settlers, traders, and drifters from miles around. Among the crowd that gathered on this particular Thursday morning was a sight that drew whispers and stares. A young Navajo girl, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, stood on a makeshift platform near the general store. Her dark hair, once glossy and thick, hung limp and tangled past her shoulders. Her traditional dress was torn and faded, and her bare feet were cracked and bleeding from what must have been a long walk across the unforgiving terrain. But it was her eyes that told the real story, dark pools that held a depth of sorrow no young person should know, yet flickered with a defiant spark that refused to be extinguished. She stood with her chin slightly raised, despite the rope that bound her wrists and the hostile gazes that surrounded her. The man standing beside her was Thomas Garrett, a trader known throughout the territory for his shrewd dealings and questionable morals. His face, weathered by years under the desert sun, bore the permanent squint of a man always calculating his next profit. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust before addressing the gathering crowd. "Now, folks," Garrett began, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "I've got here something special for the right buyer. This here Navajo girl, she's young, strong enough for work, and broken in proper. Her kin didn't want her no more after her parents died. Said she brought bad luck, couldn't weave worth a damn, couldn't even birth no babies to sell off later." The crowd murmured, some with interest, others with disgust. A few women clutched their shawls tighter and turned away, while men appraised the girl as they would livestock. "She don't speak much English," Garrett continued, "but she understands the whip well enough. Good for cleaning. Maybe some field work if you don't mind her slow ways. Hell, I'll be honest with you good people. I've been feeding her for near 2 weeks now, and I just want her off my hands." From the back of the crowd, someone shouted, "What's your price, Garrett?" The trader's eyes gleamed. "Well now, I'm a reasonable man. I know she ain't much to look at, and them Indians ain't known for their work ethic. Tell you what, $2 takes her, 2 silver dollars. And she's yours to do with as you please." The girl's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at his words, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains as if she could will herself there. More murmurs rippled through the crowd. $2 was cheap, even for the times. Some folks spent more than that on a bottle of whiskey at the saloon. The very notion of selling a human being for such a paltry sum seemed to underscore her perceived worthlessness in their eyes. $2 for a worthless Navajo girl," Garrett called out again, his voice taking on a mocking edge. "Come now, surely someone could use an extra pair of hands. Maybe old Widow Henderson needs help with her washing." The widow in question huffed indignantly and turned her back on the spectacle. It was then that Caleb Morrison arrived at the market. He hadn't come for the spectacle. In fact, he'd only made the journey to town to purchase seeds for the late planting season. At 34, Caleb was considered young to be a widower, though the past 2 years had aged him beyond his time. His sandy brown hair was already showing threads of gray at the temples, and lines of grief had etched themselves around his blue eyes. He guided his wagon through the crowd, intending to make his way to the feed store, when something made him pause. Perhaps it was the girl's posture, proud despite her circumstances. Or maybe it was the way the morning light caught her face, revealing the quiet dignity beneath the dirt and despair. Caleb found himself dismounting from his wagon, drawn forward by something he couldn't quite name. As he approached, he heard Garrett's crude sales pitch and felt his stomach turn. He'd seen plenty of cruelty in his years on the frontier, but this casual dehumanization struck him deeply. "They sold a worthless Navajo girl for $2, Garrett was saying again, playing to the crowd's baser instincts. That's what her own people valued her at, $2. Surely she's worth at least that to one of you fine folks. The girl's eyes flickered briefly to Caleb as he pushed through the crowd. For just a moment, their gazes met, and he saw something there that made his breath catch. Not pleading, not hope, but a kind of resigned determination that spoke of someone who had learned to endure whatever came. "I'll take her," Caleb heard himself say, his voice cutting through the chatter. The crowd turned to look at him, and Garrett's face lit up with surprise and greed. "Well now, Mr. Morrison, didn't expect to see you here today. You sure about this? A man living alone might find use for a servant, I suppose." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out $2 silver, money he'd saved carefully for seeds and supplies. Without hesitation, he placed them in Garrett's outstretched palm. "Just give me her papers and we'll be gone." "Papers?" Garrett laughed, a harsh sound like a crow's caw. "This ain't no fancy slave auction back east. Morrison, she's yours now, simple as that, though I got a bill of sale here if you want it for your records." He produced a crumpled piece of paper and scrawled something on it with a stub of pencil, then handed it to Caleb with a smirk. "There you go. One Navajo female, sold fair and square. You have yourself a good day now." The crowd began to disperse. Their entertainment concluded. Some muttered disapprovingly about Caleb's purchase, while others speculated about his intentions. He ignored them all, stepping up to the platform where the girl still stood. "Come on," he said quietly, reaching out to help her down. She flinched slightly but allowed him to steady her as she stepped onto the ground. Up close, he could see she was even younger than he'd thought, probably no more than 17. Her wrists were raw where the rope had chafed them. Caleb pulled out his pocket knife and cut the bonds, letting the rope fall to the dust. The girl rubbed her wrists slowly, still watching him with those dark, careful eyes. "My wagon's over there," he said, gesturing. "Can you walk?" She nodded once, a small movement, and followed him through the thinning crowd. Behind them, Caleb heard someone say, "Morrison's gone soft in the head since his wife died, wasting good money on an Indian girl." Another voice added, $2 for that worthless thing. He might as well have thrown his money in the fire." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He helped the girl up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. As he took the reins, he glanced at her profile, the high cheekbones, the determined set of her mouth despite everything she'd endured. "We've got a fair piece to travel," he said, not really expecting a response. "My place is about 3 hours north, near Juniper Ridge. You'll be safe there." The girl turned to look at him then, really look at him, as if trying to decipher what kind of man would spend his seed money on a stranger. Whatever she saw in his weathered face seemed to satisfy her for the moment, because she gave the slightest nod and turned her attention to the road ahead. As Caleb guided the wagon out of Bitter Creek, leaving behind the whispers and the judgment, he wondered what in God's name he'd just done. He'd come for seeds and was leaving with a young woman who'd been sold for less than the price of a saddle. But something about the way she held herself, even in the midst of such degradation, had called to something deep within him. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was simple human decency. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The sun climbed higher as they left the town behind, and the desert stretched out before them in all its harsh beauty. Neither spoke as the wagon wheels creaked along the rough trail, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two wounded souls who had unexpectedly found themselves sharing a path into an uncertain future. Behind them, the dust of Bitter Creek settled back into place, as if the morning's shameful transaction had never occurred. But for Caleb Morrison and the Navajo girl whose name he didn't yet know, everything had changed with the exchange of $2 silver and an act of unexpected compassion in a land where kindness was often as scarce as water. The trail north from Bitter Creek wound through increasingly rugged terrain, following ancient paths carved by centuries of travelers, native peoples, Spanish explorers, and now American settlers. The wagon wheels groaned in protest as they navigated the rocky ground, and dust devils danced in the distance like restless spirits. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail ahead, occasionally glancing at the girl beside him. She sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes scanning the landscape with the wariness of a wild creature expecting danger. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and he noticed the sheen of sweat on her brow, the way she swayed slightly with exhaustion. "There's water in the canteen behind the seat," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he'd speak to a spooked horse. "Help yourself." She didn't move at first, as if testing whether this was some kind of trap. Then, slowly, she reached back and found the canteen. Her hands shook slightly as she unscrewed the cap, and she drank carefully, sparingly, like someone who had learned not to trust abundance. The landscape around them grew more dramatic as they traveled. Red sandstone cliffs rose on either side of the trail, their layers telling the story of millions of years. Juniper and piñón trees clung to the rocky slopes, their twisted forms speaking of survival against the odds. In the distance, a golden eagle circled on the thermals, its cry piercing the desert's silence. They had been traveling for perhaps an hour when the western horizon began to darken ominously. Caleb had lived in the territory long enough to recognize the signs. A sandstorm was building. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain that might never reach the ground. "Storm coming," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll need to find shelter." The girl's eyes widened slightly as she looked toward the approaching wall of dust. She had seen such storms before, knew their fury. Without thinking, she pointed to a cluster of rocks ahead and to the left, where an overhang might provide protection. Caleb followed her gesture and nodded. "Good eye." He urged the horses off the main trail, guiding them toward the rocky outcropping. They had barely reached the shelter of the overhang when the storm hit with full force. The world disappeared into a howling chaos of dust and sand. The horses whinnied nervously, and Caleb jumped down to secure them, pulling their heads close and covering their nostrils with cloth. The girl slid down from the wagon without prompting and helped him spread a canvas tarp to create a barrier against the worst of the storm. For nearly an hour, they huddled in their makeshift shelter while the sandstorm raged. The girl had pulled part of her dress up to cover her nose and mouth, and Caleb did the same with his bandana. In the strange twilight created by the storm, sitting close enough to touch but maintaining careful distance, they waited. When the worst had passed and the air began to clear, Caleb found the girl watching him with something like curiosity in her dark eyes. "Thank you," he said, gesturing to where she'd spotted the shelter. "You probably saved us some misery." She nodded once, then looked away, as if even this small acknowledgement of her usefulness was more than she expected. They resumed their journey as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The storm had transformed the landscape, leaving ripples in the sand like frozen waves and uncovering stones that gleamed like bones in the dying light. The temperature began to drop, a reminder that the desert could be as cold as it was hot, as purple shadows lengthened across the trail. Caleb reached behind the seat again and pulled out a worn blanket. Without comment, he handed it to the girl. She hesitated, then wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight against the evening chill. "Not much further now," he said. "Maybe another hour to my place." The trail began to climb, winding through a canyon where the last light of day painted the rocks in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. The girl tensed at the sound, memories flickering across her face like shadows. Finally, as full darkness was settling over the land, they crested a rise and Caleb's homestead came into view. It wasn't much, a modest wooden house with a pitched roof, a barn that listed slightly to the east, a well with a stone wall around it, and a small corral where a few cattle lowed softly in the darkness. A vegetable garden, now mostly bare, stretched along one side of the house, protected by a fence that had seen better days. "Home," Caleb said simply, and for the first time, the girl heard something in his voice. Not pride exactly, but a kind of weary affection for this harsh piece of land he'd carved into a life. He pulled the wagon up near the house and climbed down, moving to help her, but she had already slipped to the ground on her own. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, he'd left one burning, a habit from when Mary was alive. She looked even younger and more fragile. "Come on inside," he said, leading the way to the door. "You must be hungry." The house's interior was simple but clean. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with a few books and dishes. A rifle hung on pegs above the fireplace. Through a doorway, she could glimpse what must be a bedroom. Everything spoke of a man living alone, maintaining order against loneliness. Caleb moved to the stove and began rekindling the fire. "Sit wherever you like," he said, not looking at her. "I'll get some food going." The girl remained standing by the door, uncertain. This was the dangerous time. She knew, when the man who had bought her would reveal his true intentions. Her body was coiled tight, ready to run if necessary, though where she would go in this vast darkness, she didn't know. Caleb seemed to sense her fear, moving slowly, keeping his actions visible and predictable. He took a loaf of bread from a cloth-covered basket and cut several thick slices. He found some dried beef and a jar of preserved peaches, setting them on the table along with 2 plates. "It's not much," he said, finally looking at her directly. "But it's food. Please, eat something." When she still didn't move, he sighed and sat down at the table, taking a piece of bread for himself. "I know you don't trust me," he said quietly. "Can't say I blame you, but I meant what I said. You're safe here. I didn't buy you to harm you. Truth is, I'm not entirely sure why I did it. Just couldn't stand seeing you up there, being talked about like that." Something in his tone, the honest confusion, perhaps, or the weariness, made her take a tentative step forward, then another. Finally, she sat at the table, as far from him as the small space allowed. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as her body remembered its needs. The bread was only a day old, the beef tough but flavorful, the peaches sweet with the taste of a summer now past. Caleb ate his own meal in silence, occasionally refilling her water glass from a pitcher. When she had eaten her fill, he cleared the dishes and heated water for washing. "There's a small room off the barn," he said, not looking at her. "Used to be for the hired hand, back when I could afford one. It's got a bed and a stove. You can stay there. Lock the door from the inside if it makes you feel safer." He found a lantern and lit it, then led her outside to the small room. It was basic but clean, a narrow bed with a straw mattress, a small pot-bellied stove, a washstand with a cracked mirror. He lit the stove to take the chill off and set the lantern on a shelf. "There's water in the pitcher and some extra blankets in that chest," he said. "Outhouse is behind the main house. I'll be up at first light to tend the animals. You can, well, we'll figure things out in the morning." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "I'm Caleb," he said. "Caleb Morrison. I realize I never properly introduced myself." She looked at him for a long moment. This strange man who had bought her freedom for $2 and asked nothing in return. When she spoke, her voice was soft and hoarse from disuse. "I understand," she said in accented English. "You, safe. Thank you." Caleb nodded, a sad smile crossing his weathered features. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." He closed the door behind him, and she heard his footsteps crossing the yard back to the main house. For a long time, she stood in the center of the small room, hardly daring to believe she was alone, unbound, with a door she could lock Outside, the desert night came alive with its secret sounds, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the junipers. She moved to the small window and looked out at the star-filled sky, the same stars that had watched over her people for countless generations. Slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to sit on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin but softer than anything she'd slept on in weeks. She thought of the man, Caleb Morrison, and the sadness that seemed to cling to him like dust. Whatever his reasons for buying her, she sensed no immediate danger from him, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. She would wait, watch, and be ready. For now, though, she could rest. She lay down fully clothed, pulling the blankets up to her chin, and stared at the rough wooden ceiling. In her mind, she heard again the trader's mocking words, $2 for a worthless Navajo girl. But here, in this strange place with its lonely man and empty chairs meant for two, perhaps worth could be measured differently. As sleep finally began to claim her, she whispered her name to the darkness, holding onto it like a treasure no one could sell. Ayanna. It meant eternal blossom in her language, a name her mother had given her with hope for a future that had seemed lost until today. In the main house, Caleb sat by the dying fire, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He'd acted on impulse, guided by conscience or loneliness or both. Now he had a frightened young woman in his care, and no clear idea what to do next. But for tonight, she was safe, fed, warm, and safe. In a world that had shown her little kindness, perhaps that was enough for a start. The dawn came early to Caleb Morrison's homestead, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The red earth seemed to glow in the morning light, and the scattered juniper trees cast long shadows across the dusty ground. Already, the day promised heat, the kind that would bake the earth and send even the lizards seeking shade by noon. Ayanna had been awake long before sunrise, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. The creak of wood settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the scratch of mice in the walls. When she heard Caleb's footsteps crossing the yard, she rose and splashed cold water on her face from the pitcher, steeling herself for whatever this day might bring. She found him by the well, hauling up water for the animals. He glanced up at her approach, nodding a greeting. "Morning. Sleep all right?" She nodded, though sleep had been fitful, filled with dreams of running through endless desert with no destination. "Good," he said, pouring water into a trough where two horses waited. "There's coffee on the stove and some biscuits from yesterday. Help yourself." The morning routine unfolded with surprising ease. Without being asked, Ayanna began helping with the chores, feeding the chickens that pecked around the yard, gathering the few eggs they'd laid, sweeping the dust from the porch that would only return by evening. She worked quietly, efficiently, as if proving her worth through action rather than words. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye as he mended a broken section of fence. She moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to hard work, and he noticed how she seemed to catalog everything: the location of tools, the patterns of the animals, the rhythm of the daily tasks. "You know about cattle?" he asked when she approached the corral where his small herd milled about. "Little," she said, her English careful and measured. "My uncle, he worked on ranch. I watch, learn." It was the most she'd spoken since arriving, and Caleb felt oddly pleased by this small confidence. "Well, if you want to help, I won't turn it down. Lord knows there's more work here than one man can properly handle." As the days passed, they fell into a pattern. Mornings were for tending animals and maintaining the homestead. Afternoons, when the heat became oppressive, were for indoor tasks: mending, preparing food, maintaining equipment. Evenings brought a respite as temperatures cooled and the sky erupted in spectacular sunsets. Ayanna proved herself invaluable. She had a way with the horses, calming them with soft words in her native tongue. She knew which plants could be eaten and which were poisonous, knowledge that supplemented their meager diet. When one of the cows developed a limp, she created a poultice from desert plants that seemed to ease its pain. Slowly, she began to speak more, Not much, and never about her past, but enough that Caleb learned small things. She was 17. Her parents had died when their village was raided. The family that took her in had treated her as a burden, working her hard and feeding her little, finally selling her when drought made another mouth to feed unbearable. The homestead itself told its own story of struggle. The well, hand-dug through layers of rock and caliche, was showing signs of running low. The summer rains had failed for the second year running, and the water table was dropping. Each morning, it took longer to haul up enough water for the animals. The barn leaned because a flash flood 2 years back had undermined its foundation. Caleb had shored it up as best he could, but proper repairs required money he didn't have. The garden plot, which Mary had once coaxed into producing tomatoes and squash and beans, now yielded only the hardiest vegetables, some scraggly onions, a few tough carrots. Used to be better, Caleb said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. When Mary was alive, this place almost felt like a real home. She had a gift for making things grow. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife by name. Ayanna glanced at him but said nothing, recognizing grief when she saw it. Fever took her, he continued, his voice flat. 2 winters ago. Doctor said there was nothing to be done. She just burned up from the inside. Took 3 days. They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own memories of loss. Finally, Ayanna spoke. The land remembers, she said softly. Even when people go, land remembers. Word of Caleb's Indian house girl spread through the sparse community like wildfire. The nearest neighbors, the Andersons, lived 3 miles east, and Mrs. Anderson made it her business to know everyone else's. It ain't proper, she told her husband after catching a glimpse of Ayanna at the well during an uninvited visit. A young girl like that, living with a man alone, and a savage to boot. Mr. Anderson, more pragmatic than his wife, merely grunted. Morrison's business is his own. Man needs help running a place. But Mrs. Anderson's disapproval found eager ears at the monthly gathering at Thompson's trading post, where folks came from miles around to trade goods and gossip. Mark my words, she declared to the assembled women. No good will come of it. Those people can't be civilized. She'll rob him blind or worse. Old Sam Wheeler, nursing a whiskey at the counter, laughed harshly. Morrison always was soft. His wife was the same, treating them Indians like they were regular folk. Look where it got her, dead and buried, and him taking in strays. But not everyone shared these harsh views. Elena Martinez, whose own family had faced discrimination when they'd first arrived from Mexico, watched Ayanna with sympathetic eyes during a chance encounter at the trading post. She seems like a good girl, Elena told her husband later. Scared, but good. Maybe Morrison did a kind thing. The test came 3 weeks after Ayanna's arrival. Caleb had ridden to the Anderson place to help with a difficult calving, leaving Ayanna alone at the homestead for the first time. She was drawing water from the well when 3 riders approached. Cowboys from the Broken Spur Ranch, passing through and looking for trouble. Well, the lead rider, a mean-faced man named Jake Hobson, called out, What have we here? Morrison's little Indian princess, all alone. Ayanna's hand tightened on the well rope, but she kept her eyes down, saying nothing. Hey, girl, another rider said, dismounting. Where's your master? Inside sleeping off a drunk? He returned soon, she said quietly, still not looking up. Jake laughed. Soon, huh? Well, maybe we'll just water our horses while we wait. Maybe take a look around, see what old Morrison's got worth taking. Fear crawled up Ayanna's spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. These men were like wolves. Showing weakness would only encourage them. She remembered Caleb's rifle above the fireplace, but it was too far, and she didn't know if it was loaded. Water is there, she said, gesturing to the trough. Take what you need. But Jake had other ideas. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey and trail dust on him. Maybe we'll take more than water. Morrison won't miss a worthless squaw. Just then, the sound of hoofbeats made them all turn. Caleb was riding hard toward the homestead, and even from a distance, They could see he was armed. "Afternoon, boys," he said as he reined up, his voice deceptively mild, but his hand rested on his rifle, and his eyes were cold as winter frost. "Something I can help you with?" Jake stepped back, trying to look casual. "Just watering our horses. Morrison, your girl here was being real hospitable." "That so?" Caleb's gaze flicked to Ayanna, reading the fear she was trying to hide. "Well, the water's free to any man who asks polite, but I think your horses have had enough." The threat was subtle but clear. The three cowboys exchanged glances, weighing their options. Finally, Jake spat in the dust and mounted up. "We'll be seeing you, Morrison. You and your squaw both." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Caleb didn't move until they were out of sight. Then he dismounted and approached Ayanna, who was still standing rigid by the well. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. "I know what they wanted," Caleb said grimly. "And they won't be back. I'll make sure of that." That evening, for the first time, Ayanna ate supper in the main house instead of taking her plate to her room. They didn't speak of the afternoon's encounter, but something had shifted between them. A trust had been tested and held. As she helped clear the dishes, Ayanna paused. "Caleb," she said, and he looked up in surprise. She'd never used his name before. "Today, thank you." He nodded, understanding. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. I promise you that." Later, as she crossed the yard to her room, Ayanna stopped and looked up at the vast canopy of stars. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt something that might have been hope. This strange, sad man who had bought her for $2 had given her something worth far more, a place where she could begin to heal. The next morning, she surprised him. "My name," she said over breakfast, "is Ayanna. It means eternal blossom." Caleb smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Pleased to know you. Ayanna, truly pleased." And in that moment, on a struggling homestead where water was scarce and neighbors were hostile, two lonely souls began the slow work of building something neither had expected to find again: a home. The trouble came on a Saturday night when the desert wind carried the sound of drunken laughter across the sage. Ayanna was mending a torn shirt by lamplight when she heard the horses approaching. Too many horses, riding too fast for honest travelers after dark. Caleb was already reaching for his rifle when the riders burst into the yard, whooping and hollering. Jake Hobson was back, and this time he'd brought friends. 5 men from the Broken Spur, all of them liquored up from a day in town. Their torches cast wild shadows that danced across the walls of the house. "Morrison," Jake's voice was slurred but mean. "Come on out and bring that Indian girl with you. We got unfinished business." Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. Ayanna stood in the doorway behind him, her face calm but her hands gripping the doorframe. "You boys are drunk," Caleb said evenly. "Best head on home before someone does something they'll regret." "Regret?" One of the other riders, a thick-set man named Bull Stevens, laughed harshly. "Only thing I regret is not taking what we wanted last time. You ain't got no right keeping that squaw to yourself." "She's not property," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "She works for me, same as any hired hand. Now get off my land." Jake dismounted, swaying slightly. "Work for you? That what they're calling it now?" He took a step forward. "Way I see it, you bought damaged goods. Ought to share with your neighbors, being Christian and all." The other men laughed, an ugly sound in the darkness. One of them had produced a bottle and was passing it around, working up courage for whatever they had planned. "I won't ask again," Caleb said, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "Leave, now." "1 gun against 6 men?" Bull sneered. "You ain't that good a shot, Morrison." It was Ayanna who moved first. She slipped past Caleb and down the porch steps before he could stop her, walking straight toward the mounted men. In her hands, she carried the bucket of hot coals from the stove. "You want me," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Come take me." She hurled the bucket at the nearest horse. The animal screamed and reared as hot coals scattered across its flank, throwing its rider into the dust. In the chaos that followed, horses wheeling, men cursing, torches dropping, Caleb saw his chance. His first shot took Bull's hat off, close enough to part his hair. The second sent Jake diving for cover behind the water trough. "Next one won't miss," Caleb shouted. But the men were recovering from their surprise, reaching for their own weapons. Ayanna had retreated to the porch, but she was exposed, and Caleb couldn't cover every angle. That's when they heard it, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Not from the road, but from the east, where the Anderson place lay. Tom Anderson appeared at the edge of the firelight, his own rifle across his saddle. "Evening, boys," Tom said mildly. "Heard some commotion. Thought I'd check on my neighbor." Behind him, two of his sons emerged from the darkness, also armed. The odds had shifted dramatically. Jake struggled to his feet, trying to salvage some dignity. "This ain't your business, Anderson. Man threatening my neighbor in the dead of night? I'd say that's exactly my business." Tom's voice remained conversational, but his rifle was pointed at Jake's chest. "Now, Morrison asked you polite to leave. I won't be so polite." The Broken Spur men looked at each other, calculating. They were drunk, but not so drunk they couldn't count. Finally, Jake spat in the dust and mounted his horse. "This ain't over, Morrison," he growled. "That girl's brought nothing but trouble since you took her in. You'll see." They rode off into the darkness, their drunken bravado deflated. Tom Anderson and his sons waited until the hoofbeats faded before dismounting. "Obliged, Tom," Caleb said, lowering his rifle at last. Tom shrugged. "Don't like bullies. Never have." He glanced at Ayanna, who stood silent on the porch. "You all right, miss?" She nodded, surprise flickering across her features at being addressed respectfully. "That was quick thinking with the coals," one of Tom's sons said admiringly. "Brave, too. Brave or foolish," Tom corrected, but not unkindly. He turned to Caleb. "They'll be back. Men like Jake don't forget being made to look foolish." "I know," Caleb said grimly. "Might be time to think about some precautions," Tom suggested. "My boys and I can help shore up your defenses tomorrow if you'd like. And maybe it's time you taught the young lady to shoot." After the Andersons left, Caleb and Ayanna worked in silence to clean up the scattered coals and torch debris. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving them both shaky. "That was dangerous, what you did," Caleb said finally. "Could have gotten yourself killed. They would have hurt you." Ayanna replied simply, "Maybe killed because of me, not because of you. Because they're small men who think strength means taking what they want." He paused, studying her face in the lamplight. "Tom's right, though. You should know how to defend yourself. Will you let me teach you?" She met his eyes. "Yes." Over the next days, the homestead transformed into a small fortress. Tom Anderson and his sons helped dig defensive positions and reinforce the doors and windows. More importantly, word spread through the community about what had happened, while some, like Mrs. Anderson, still disapproved of Caleb's arrangement. The attempted night raid had crossed a line that even prejudiced neighbors couldn't ignore. Elena Martinez rode over with her husband, bringing fresh bread and pickled vegetables. No woman should fear such men. She told Ayanna firmly, "You need anything, you send word." Even crusty Sam Wheeler from the trading post rode out to offer his support, though he grumbled the whole time. "Don't mean I approve," he told Caleb. "But ain't no call for what them boys tried to do. A man's home ought to be respected." In the evenings, Caleb taught Ayanna to shoot. She was a quick learner, with steady hands and sharp eyes. They practiced with his old Navy Colt and the rifle, setting up targets against the hillside. "Squeeze, don't jerk," he instructed, standing behind her to adjust her stance. "Let your breath out slow and squeeze between heartbeats." The gun cracked, and the tin can flew off the fence post. Ayanna allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. "You're a natural," Caleb said, and meant it. "Your people, they use guns." "Some," she said. "But my father, he said gun is tool, like hoe or hammer. Not good, not bad. Depends on hand that holds it." "Smart man. Your father." They practiced until dusk, when the failing light made accuracy impossible. As they walked back to the house, Ayanna suddenly stopped. "Caleb," she said, and something in her voice made him turn. "The men, they will come back. Maybe bring more. Maybe," he admitted. "You could send me away. Would be safer for you." The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. Over the past weeks, he'd grown accustomed to her presence, the quiet way she moved about the homestead, her gentle hand with the animals, the companionship of shared meals and evening conversations. The thought of the place without her was suddenly unbearable. "No," he said firmly. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it. We'll face whatever comes together." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her dark eyes, a deepening of trust, perhaps, or maybe something more. "Together," she repeated softly. That night, Caleb lay awake thinking about the way she'd said that word, the way she'd looked at him. For 2 years, his heart had been as barren as drought-struck land, capable only of going through the motions of living. But somehow, this quiet young woman with her burden of sorrow had begun to change that. He thought of Mary, wondering what she would think of Ayanna. She would have liked her, he decided. Mary had always seen the good in people, always fought against the casual cruelties of frontier life. She would have stood beside them against the Jake Hobsons of the world. In her room, Ayanna was also awake, cleaning the navy coat Caleb had given her to keep. The weight of it was reassuring in her hands, not because she wanted to use it, but because it meant she had choices now. She could defend herself, could stand beside this good man who had shown her kindness when the world had forgotten what that meant. She thought of the Andersons coming to help, of Elena Martinez's fierce protectiveness, of even sour Sam Wheeler's grudging support. Perhaps not all whites were like Jake Hobson and the family that had sold her. Perhaps there was room in this harsh land for something better. Through her window, she could see light still burning in the main house. Caleb would be sitting by the fire, probably reading one of his books or mending harness. It was a comfortable thought, knowing he was there, knowing she wasn't alone. For the first time in months, Ayanna allowed herself to think beyond mere survival. Maybe, just maybe, she could build a life here, not the life she'd once imagined, but something new, something unexpected. The desert wind whispered around the buildings, carrying the scent of sage and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Jake Hobson would return. She was certain of that. But tonight, she was safe. She had a roof over her head, food in her belly, and a man who would stand between her and harm. More than that, she realized with a flutter of something that might have been hope. She had found someone who saw her not as a $2 purchase or a worthless Indian girl, but as a person worthy of respect and protection. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was a foundation on which love might grow. If they could survive what was coming. The drought deepened as summer stretched into its final, brutal months. Each morning, the sun rose like a brass coin in a white-hot sky, and the earth cracked open like broken pottery. The few remaining wisps of grass turned to dust, and even the hardy sage seemed to shrivel in the unrelenting heat. Caleb stood at the well, hauling up the rope hand over hand, his shoulders aching with the effort. The bucket came up less than half full, and what water it held was murky with sediment. "Getting worse," he said to Ayanna, who waited with the water buckets. "At this rate, we'll be dry before autumn." She took the bucket from him, her fingers brushing his as she did. "The cattle," she said quietly, "they will die without water." He nodded grimly. 3 head had already been lost, found dead by the dried-up creek bed where they'd gone searching for water that was no longer there. The remaining dozen were growing gaunt, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. That afternoon, Caleb made the hard decision to sell half the remaining herd. He and Ayanna drove them to Thompson's trading post, where the price offered was insulting. Everyone knew desperate sellers had no bargaining power. "Best I can do is $8 a head," Thompson said, not meeting Caleb's eyes. "Market's flooded with drought cattle." It was robbery. But Caleb took it. They needed the money for supplies to see them through. And fewer cattle meant their precious water might last longer. As they prepared to leave, Ayanna noticed something that made her grab Caleb's arm. A group of Navajo women were trading blankets at the far end of the post, and among them was an elderly woman she recognized. "My mother's sister," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion she rarely showed. I thought all dead." Caleb understood immediately. "Go," he said. "Talk to her." Ayanna approached slowly, as if the woman might vanish like a desert mirage. The elder looked up, and her weathered face transformed with recognition and joy. They embraced, speaking rapidly in Navajo, tears streaming down both their faces. When Ayanna returned to Caleb, she was different, lighter somehow, as if a burden had been eased. "She says my mother's mother still lives," she said wonderingly. "In the mountains, 2 days north. She thinks I am dead." "We could go," Caleb offered immediately. "Let her know you're alive." Ayanna looked at him with such gratitude that it took his breath away. "But the drought, the animals, they'll keep for a few days. Family's more important." But she shook her head. "Not now. Too dangerous to travel. And you need help here. But someday I will go." That evening, energized by the unexpected connection to her past, Ayanna surprised Caleb with a suggestion. "Tomorrow, I show you something. Maybe help with water." At first light, she led him on foot into the hills behind the homestead, following paths he'd never noticed despite 2 years on the land. They climbed for an hour, winding between red rocks and stunted trees, until they reached a narrow canyon. "Here," she said, kneeling beside what looked like an ordinary crack in the rock. But when Caleb looked closer, he saw dampness, actual moisture seeping from the stone. "My people know these places," Ayanna explained, already working to clear debris from around the seep. Hidden water, gift from the earth. Not much, but in bad times. Working together, they enlarged the catch basin that ancient hands had carved into the rock. By afternoon, it had collected perhaps 2 gallons of clear, cool water. It wasn't much, but it was something. "There are others," Ayanna said as they made their way back. "I can find them. And here," she stopped beside a cluster of prickly pear cactus. "These pads. Cut careful. Cattle will eat. Not good food, but keeps them alive." Over the following days, she showed him a dozen small tricks of survival her people had learned over generations in this hard land. How to read the flight patterns of birds to find water. Which roots could be eaten in desperation. How to predict weather changes by the behavior of ants. "You're amazing," Caleb said one evening as she taught him to weave yucca fibers into rope. They sat on the porch as the sun set, their chairs close together, working by the fading light. "Not amazing," she corrected. "Just remember what grandmother taught. Your people, they try to change the land. My people, we learn to live with it." "Maybe that's why," Caleb started, then stopped, uncertain. "Why what?" He set down his work and looked at her directly. "Why I feel like I've been doing everything wrong since Mary died. Fighting the land instead of working with it. Fighting loneliness instead of—" He trailed off again. "Instead of," Ayanna prompted softly. "Instead of accepting help when it's offered." He finished. "I'm glad you're here, Ayanna. More glad than I probably should be." The words hung between them in the cooling air. Ayanna felt her heart beat faster, but she kept her hands steady on her work. Among her people, important things were not rushed. "I'm glad too," she said finally. "This place, it becomes home. You." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You become important." Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her hand in his, marveling at how right it felt. Her small, work-roughened fingers intertwined with his. They sat that way as stars began to appear, neither speaking, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, more like water slowly filling a vessel, drop by patient drop. The drought continued its merciless assault. Despite their efforts, the main well dropped lower each day. The garden withered completely, and dust devils danced across the barren fields. But somehow, it didn't feel quite as hopeless as before. Together, they implemented Ayana's knowledge. They set up catchments for the rare thunderstorms that built over the mountains but usually dissipated before dropping rain. They fed the cattle carefully prepared prickly pear and led them to the hidden seeps in the hills. They conserved every drop of water, using it first for drinking, then for cooking, then for washing, and finally, for the struggling animals. Neighbors noticed the change. Where other homesteads were failing completely, Morrison's place hung on. Tom Anderson rode over to ask advice and found Ayana teaching Caleb how to dig for water-storing roots. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom said admiringly. "Begging your pardon, miss, but that's clever. Old knowledge," Ayana said simply. "Happy to share." Word spread quietly through the community. Elena Martinez brought her children to learn about edible desert plants. Even Mrs. Anderson, her prejudices softened by desperation, reluctantly asked for advice when their well ran completely dry. Not everyone was pleased by this development. Jake Hobson, still nursing his grudge, spread poisonous rumors in town. "That Indian witch has Morrison under some kind of spell," he told anyone who would listen, "probably calling on heathen spirits. Mark my words. She'll bring a curse on all of us." But his words carried less weight now. Too many people had seen Ayana's quiet kindness, her willing help regardless of how they'd treated her before. The drought was bringing out both the best and worst in people, and increasingly, folks recognized which category Jake fell into. One evening, as Caleb and Ayana worked to repair a catchment basin, she suddenly stopped and tilted her head, listening. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "The air," she said. "Smell different, feel different." She studied the western horizon where clouds were building, not the usual teasing formations that dissipated without releasing rain, but something darker, more substantial. Maybe rain coming, real rain. Caleb had learned to trust her instincts. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing, clearing channels to direct water to their storage barrels, securing loose items that might blow away, moving the weakest cattle to shelter. That night, the storm broke with a violence that shook the house. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled across the desert like war drums. And then, blessed, miraculous, rain fell. Not a brief shower, but a steady, soaking downpour that lasted hours. Caleb and Ayana stood on the porch, letting the rain soak them, laughing like children. Without thinking, driven by joy and relief, and something deeper. Caleb pulled her close and kissed her. For a moment she stiffened, surprised, then melted against him, returning the kiss with a sweetness that made his heart pound. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Ayana touched his face gently. "Is this acceptable?" she asked. "I am Navajo. You are white. People will talk more." "Let them talk," Caleb said fiercely. "I've spent 2 years feeling like the drought was inside me, too. Everything dried up and dead. You brought the rain back. Ayana, not just to the land, but to me." She smiled then, a full, radiant smile he'd never seen before. "You save me for $2, she said, "but you give me worth beyond measure." They stood together in the rain, holding each other, while around them the thirsty earth drank deep and the desert began its ancient ritual of renewal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The drought wasn't broken by one storm, and Jake Hobson's hatred hadn't disappeared. But tonight, with the rain drumming on the roof and hope rekindled in 2 scarred hearts, anything seemed possible. Even love between a grieving farmer and a Navajo woman who'd been sold for the price of a bottle of whiskey. Perhaps especially that love, born from hardship and nurtured by mutual respect and shared struggle. The desert had taught them both about survival, Now, perhaps it would teach them about blooming after the rain. The news spread through the scattered homesteads like wildfire in dry grass. Caleb Morrison and his Navajo woman were sparking. Some had seen them in town, standing closer than was proper, sharing glances that spoke of more than a working arrangement. Elena Martinez, buying supplies at Thompson's, had witnessed Caleb purchase a silver hair comb and seen the tender way Ayanna touched his hand in thanks. "It ain't natural," Jake Hobson declared to his drinking companions at the Broken Spur Ranch. "Bad enough he's harboring her, but now he's carrying on with her like she's a decent woman." The foreman, Walt Brennan, was tired of Jake's obsession. "Let it be, Jake. Morrison's not bothering anyone." But Jake's hatred had fermented into something darker. "He made a fool of me. Him and that savage both. Someone needs to remind them of the natural order of things." The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Caleb woke to find one of his cattle dead, shot through the head, left where he'd be sure to find it. Pinned to the carcass was a note. "This is what happens to Indian lovers." Ayanna found him standing over the dead animal, fists clenched. "Jake," she said. It wasn't a question. "Has to be." Caleb's voice was tight with controlled anger. "But I can't prove it." That afternoon, while Ayanna was checking the northern fence line, she heard horses approaching. 3 riders, moving fast. She recognized Jake immediately. Flanked by 2 men she didn't know. Her hand went to the Navy Colt at her hip, but she didn't draw. 3 against 1 were bad odds. Well, Jake drawled, reining up just close enough to be threatening. "The little savage, all alone? Where's your protector?" "Working," Ayanna said evenly. "As I am, you need something." "Just delivering a message," Jake said. He pulled out a whiskey bottle, took a long drink, then hurled it at her feet where it shattered on the rocks. "Tell Morrison he's got 2 choices. Either send you back where you belong, or we'll burn him out. This territory's got no place for Indian lovers." One of his companions, younger and clearly uncomfortable, shifted in his saddle. "Jake, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Pete!" Jake snarled. He looked back at Ayanna. 2 days. After that, things get unpleasant. They wheeled their horses and galloped off, leaving Ayanna standing among the broken glass. She waited until they were out of sight before allowing her hands to shake. When she told Caleb that evening, his face went dark as a thundercloud. "That's it," he said. "I'm going to the sheriff." But they both knew Sheriff Coleman in Bitter Creek was next to useless, more interested in keeping the peace by ignoring problems than solving them. Sure enough, when Caleb made the ride to town the next day, Coleman barely looked up from his desk. "Jake Hobson making threats. You got witnesses." Ayanna heard him clearly. Coleman snorted. "An Indian's word against a white man's? Come on, Morrison. You know how that plays out. My advice, send the girl away for a while. Let things cool down." Caleb left the sheriff's office disgusted but not surprised. On his way back through town, he stopped at several shops, making purchases that raised eyebrows. Ammunition, lamp oil, materials for makeshift fire breaks. Tom Anderson was loading supplies when he saw Caleb. "Heard Jake's been making noise," he said quietly. "More than noise," Caleb replied. "Shot one of my cattle, threatened to burn me out." Tom's face hardened. "When?" "Gave me 2 days. That's tomorrow." "You planning to ford up?" "Don't have much choice. Sheriff won't help." Tom was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "My boys and I, we'll be riding near your place tomorrow evening, checking on strays. You understand? Might camp nearby if the weather looks uncertain." The gratitude Caleb felt nearly overwhelmed him. "Tom, I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask. Man's got a right to check on his strays wherever they might wander." Word traveled fast. By the time Caleb got home, he found Elena Martinez's wagon in his yard, her husband Miguel unloading supplies. "Heard you might have trouble," Elena said briskly. "Brought some extra food and medical supplies. Also this." She handed Ayanna a rifle. "Was my father's. You know how to use it?" "Yes," Ayanna said softly. "But why you help? I am not your people." Elena's face softened. Child, when I first came here from Mexico, plenty of folks said I wasn't their people either. But some stood by us when we needed it. This is how we change things, one kindness at a time. As the sun set on what might be their last peaceful evening, Caleb and Ayanna worked side by side, preparing defenses. They filled barrels with water to fight fires, loaded weapons, positioned supplies. But as darkness fell, Caleb found he couldn't focus on tactics. Ayanna, he said suddenly, if something happens tomorrow, nothing will happen, she interrupted. We are ready. But if it does, he caught her hands, stilling them. I need you to know something. These past months, you've given me back my life. After Mary died, I was just going through the motions, waiting to join her. Then you came, and everything changed. She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. You gave me life too. When they sold me, I thought I was nothing, worth only $2. You showed me different. I love you, he said simply. I know it's complicated and folks don't approve, but I love you. Ayanna. And I love you, she whispered. My heart chose before my mind understood. He kissed her then, pouring all his fear and hope and determination into that connection. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Whatever comes tomorrow, we face it together. Together, she agreed. The attack came at midnight. Ayanna was on watch when she saw the torches moving through the darkness. 5, 6, maybe more riders approaching from the south. She fired the warning shot they'd agreed on, and Caleb was beside her in seconds. How many? 8? Maybe 9? Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. The riders stopped just outside rifle range. Jake's voice carried clearly in the still night air. Last chance, Morrison. Send out the squaw, and we ride away peaceful. Caleb's answer was a rifle shot that knocked Jake's hat into the dust. There's your answer. Hobson. Any man sets foot on my property uninvited gets the same. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jake roared with rage and spurred his horse forward, his men following. Some carried torches, others guns, all howling like demons. The battle was brief but vicious. Caleb and Ayanna fired steadily from cover, their practice sessions paying off. 2 attackers fell from their horses immediately, but there were too many, and some got close enough to hurl torches onto the barn roof, just when it seemed they'd be overwhelmed. More gunfire erupted from the east. Tom Anderson and his sons had arrived, along with Miguel Martinez and even old Sam Wheeler, complaining loudly about the hour but shooting straight, caught between 2 groups of defenders. Jake's men quickly lost their appetite for the fight. Fall back, someone shouted, and they wheeled their horses in confusion. But Jake, drunk on whiskey and rage, charged straight at the house where Ayanna was visible in the doorway. His revolver was raised, his intentions clear. 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously, from Caleb, from Ayanna, and from Tom Anderson. Jake tumbled from his horse and lay still in the dust. The remaining attackers fled into the night, leaving behind 2 dead and 1 wounded. The barn roof was ablaze, but the prepared water barrels and many hands made quick work of the fire. As dawn broke over the smoke-stained homestead, Sheriff Coleman finally arrived, looking deeply unhappy. Hell of a mess, Morrison. Self-defense, Tom Anderson said firmly. 9 of us witnessed it. Jake Hobson led an armed attack on this property. We responded with appropriate force. Coleman looked around at the assembled neighbors, respected ranchers and townsfolk all, and sighed. I'll need statements from everyone. The wounded attacker, Pete Williams, proved talkative once he realized he might hang for attempted murder. Jake planned it all. He wheezed while Elena tended his shoulder. Said we'd burn them out, take the Indian girl, said no one would care about 1 dead Indian lover. With Pete's testimony and so many witnesses, even Coleman couldn't ignore the truth. By noon, the remaining attackers were in custody, and Jake Hobson's body was on its way to an unmarked grave. As the neighbors prepared to leave, each stopped to speak with Caleb and Ayanna. The night's events had shifted something fundamental in the community's perception. You fought bravely. Tom Anderson told Ayanna directly. I was wrong to judge before knowing. You'll have no more trouble from decent folks around here, even Sam Wheeler grudgingly admitted. Guess you earned your place here. Girl, both of you. When they were finally alone, Caleb and Ayanna stood surveying the damage. The barn was scorched but standing. One wall of the house was peppered with bullet holes, and the acrid smell of smoke hung in the air. We survived, Ayanna said wonderingly. More than survived, Caleb corrected, pulling her close. We won, not just against Jake, but against the hatred he represented. Look at how the neighbors came. That wouldn't have happened 6 months ago. She leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid reality of him, alive and whole. They accepted us. They accepted you, he said. And us. It's a start. As they stood there in the morning light, surrounded by the evidence of violence but also of community, Ayanna thought of the long journey from that platform in Bitter Creek. Sold for $2 as something worthless. She had found her worth, not in anyone else's estimation, but in her own courage, her knowledge, her capacity to love and be loved. I love you wild and free, Caleb murmured into her hair. Just as you are, and I love you, she replied. My protector, my heart. The desert wind carried away the last of the smoke, revealing a clear blue sky full of promise. There would be other challenges, there always were in this hard land, but they would face them as they had faced this one, together, with courage, and with the gradually growing acceptance of a community learning to see beyond old prejudices. The courthouse in Bitter Creek had seen better days. Paint peeled from its wooden walls, and the floorboards creaked with every step. But on this October morning, it was packed to capacity with curious townspeople, all come to witness the trial of the surviving attackers from the raid on the Morrison homestead. Judge Samuel Whitfield, a circuit judge known for his fairness despite his crusty demeanor, gavelled the proceedings to order. This court will now hear the matter of the Territory versus Williams, Crenshaw, and Dobbs, charged with attempted murder, arson, and destruction of property. Ayanna sat in the front row beside Caleb, acutely aware of the eyes upon her. She wore her best dress, a simple blue calico that Elena Martinez had helped her make, and her hair was braided in the traditional Navajo style. Caleb had wanted her to stay home, worried about the hostility she might face, but she had insisted. This is my fight too, she had said. I will not hide. The prosecutor, a young man named Charles Hartley, fresh from law school back east, seemed nervous but determined. Your Honor, the Territory will show that these men, led by the deceased Jake Hobson, did willfully and with malice aforethought attack the Morrison homestead with intent to murder its inhabitants and destroy their property. The defense attorney, Walter Briggs, a local man known for taking any case for the right price, stood up immediately. Your Honor, I object to this entire proceeding. My clients were merely expressing their concern about unnatural arrangements that threaten the moral fabric of our community. Judge Whitfield's eyebrows rose. Unnatural arrangements. Mr. Briggs? A white man taking up with an Indian woman, Your Honor. My clients believed they were protecting community standards. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded agreement. Others shook their heads in disgust. Mr. Briggs, the judge said coldly. Last I checked, attempted murder wasn't a recognized method of protecting community standards. Proceed. Mr. Hartley. The prosecutor called his first witness, Tom Anderson. Tom took the stand solidly, his weathered face serious. Tell us what you saw that night, Mr. Anderson. Tom's testimony was clear and damning. He described arriving to find the Morrison place under attack, seeing armed men throwing torches, hearing Jake Hobson's threats. They came to kill. He concluded. No doubt in my mind. Briggs cross-examined aggressively. Isn't it true, Mr. Anderson, that you've only recently begun associating with the Morrison place? Perhaps your judgment has been influenced? Tom's jaw tightened. My judgment is based on what I saw with my own eyes. Armed men attacking a neighbor's home. Nothing more complicated than that. One by one, the other witnesses testified. Miguel Martinez, Sam Wheeler, even Mrs. Anderson, who reluctantly admitted she'd seen the flames from her kitchen window. Each testimony built the case against the defendants. Then came the moment Ayanna had dreaded and anticipated. "The prosecution calls Miss Ayanna to the stand." A louder murmur swept the room. An Indian woman testifying in a white court was almost unheard of. Ayanna rose, her chin high, and walked to the witness stand with measured steps. "State your name for the record," Hartley said gently. Ayanna," she said clearly. "I have no white surname. Do you swear to tell the truth? The whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I swear on the honor of my ancestors and the God of this court." Judge Whitfield studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." "Miss Ayanna," Hartley began, "please tell the court about your first encounter with Jake Hobson." Briggs jumped up. "Objection. This witness is not competent to testify. She's an Indian, Your Honor. They don't understand our concepts of truth and law." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Briggs, I'll decide who's competent in my courtroom. The witness speaks clear English and has taken an oath. Objection overruled." Ayanna told her story simply. The threats at the well, the dead cattle, the ultimatum Jake had given. She spoke in English, but occasionally a Navajo word would slip in when English failed to capture her meaning, and she would pause to translate. "He said I was worthless," she concluded. "Said Mr. Morrison was going against nature by protecting me. Said they would burn us out if I didn't leave." Briggs's cross-examination was brutal. "Isn't it true you were sold for $2? That your own people didn't want you?" Ayanna met his eyes steadily. "I was sold by people who were not my true family. In a time of great hardship, my worth is not measured in dollars." "But you are living with Mr. Morrison unmarried. Isn't that improper by any standard?" "I work for Mr. Morrison. I have my own quarters. We have done nothing improper. Yet you claim to love him." The courtroom held its breath. Ayanna was silent for a long moment, then spoke with quiet dignity. "Yes, I love him. He showed me kindness when the world showed me none. He taught me I had value. If love is improper, then I am guilty." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Some women in the gallery dabbed at their eyes. Others looked scandalized. When Pete Williams took the stand as a prosecution witness, his testimony sealed the case. Still recovering from his wound, he detailed Jake's planning, his obsession with punishing Morrison, his determination to put the Indian in her place. "I shouldn't have gone along," Pete said, looking at the defendant's table where his former companions sat. "But Jake, he had a way of talking, making it seem like we were doing right. We weren't. What we did was wrong, and I'm prepared to pay for it." The defense's case was weak. Briggs called character witnesses who testified that the defendants were good men who'd been led astray. But under Hartley's cross-examination, most admitted they hadn't actually witnessed the events in question. Then Briggs made a fatal error. He called Caleb Morrison as a hostile witness. "Mr. Morrison," Briggs began with a sneer, "you paid $2 for this woman. Doesn't that make her your property, your slave?" Caleb's eyes flashed dangerously. "No, sir. It makes me the man who paid $2 to free her from people who thought they could own another human being. But you keep her at your place. Feed her, clothe her. What do you get in return? I get the help of someone who knows this land better than I ever will. I get the companionship of a good and decent person. I get—" He paused, looking directly at Ayanna. "I get the blessing of knowing someone worth far more than all the gold in California." "So you admit to improper feelings for this savage—" The gavel slammed down. "Mr. Briggs, you will refrain from using such language in my court." But Caleb was already continuing, his voice rising. "I bought her for $2. Yes, $2 that were meant for seeds, for my future, and it was the best investment I ever made. Not because I own her, I don't, and I never did, but because it brought into my life someone who taught me to live again after I thought I'd forgotten how." He looked around the packed courtroom. You all knew my Mary. You know what losing her did to me. I was the walking dead, just going through the motions. Then Ayanna came, and she brought knowledge that saved my cattle during the drought. She brought courage when we were attacked. She brought life back to a place that was dying. His voice dropped, but it carried clearly. If loving her is a crime, then arrest me too. But don't pretend those men came to my place for any reason other than hatred and violence. The closing arguments were brief. Hartley focused on the facts. Armed men attacking a homestead. Clear intent to harm. Briggs made one last attempt to play on prejudices, but his heart wasn't in it. Judge Whitfield deliberated for less than an hour before returning with his verdict. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of arson, guilty. On the charge of destruction of property, guilty. He looked at the defendants sternly. You men let hatred and prejudice lead you to violence. That ends here. Crenshaw and Dobbs, 5 years hard labor. Williams, considering your cooperation and obvious remorse, 2 years. As the defendants were led away, the judge wasn't finished. I have something else to say, and I want everyone in this courtroom to hear it. This territory is changing. We're building a civilization here, and that means law and order. It means judging people by their actions, not their birth. He looked directly at Ayanna. Young woman, you conducted yourself with dignity in this court. You told the truth despite hostile questioning. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Then to Caleb. Mr. Morrison, you defended your property and the people under your protection. No man can fault you for that. Court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd gathered around Caleb and Ayanna. Some offered congratulations, others just curious looks. Elena Martinez pushed through to embrace Ayanna. You were so brave, she said. You showed them who you really are. Tom Anderson shook Caleb's hand firmly. Judge was right. Things are changing. About time, too. Even Sheriff Coleman, looking somewhat chastened, approached. Morrison, Miss Ayanna, want you to know I'll be keeping a closer eye on things from now on. This shouldn't have gotten as far as it did. As they climbed into their wagon to head home, Ayanna was quiet. Caleb took her hand. You all right? That man, Pete Williams, he spoke truth at the end. That took courage. People can change. Caleb agreed. Sometimes they just need a push in the right direction. The judge, he said I have nothing to be ashamed of. Her voice was wondering. In a white man's court, he said this. Because it's true. She squeezed his hand. Things are changing, like Mr. Anderson said. But Caleb, we still cannot marry. The laws change too, he said firmly. And until they do, we know what we are to each other. That's what matters. As they drove out of town, Ayanna noticed people watching them differently than before. Some still with hostility. Yes, but others with something that might have been respect. The trial had forced the community to confront its prejudices in a public forum. And while not everyone's mind had changed, a precedent had been set. I was so angry when they sold me, Ayanna said softly as the town disappeared behind them. Thought my life was ending, but maybe it was beginning. Beginning of our life, Caleb corrected. Together. The sun was setting as they reached home, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The bullet holes in the house wall remained, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But they also stood as testament to their survival, their courage, and the slowly changing hearts of a frontier community. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear, Ayanna spoke words in Navajo, a blessing her grandmother had taught her for new beginnings. Caleb didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning in her voice, the hope for a future that seemed a little brighter after this day. Justice had been served, imperfect but real, and in a territory where might too often made right. That was no small victory. The spring of 1888 arrived with a vengeance of beauty, as if the desert sought to make amends for the harsh years before. Rain had fallen steadily through the winter, and now the land exploded with color. Purple lupines carpeted the valleys, Golden poppies covered the hillsides, and the cacti burst forth with blooms of magenta and yellow. The red earth seemed to pulse with life. Caleb stood at the edge of his property, marveling at the transformation. Where once there had been only dust and struggling plants, now green grass grew tall enough to brush the cattle's bellies. The well, which had nearly run dry during the drought, now yielded clear, abundant water. "The land remembers the rain," Ayanna said, coming to stand beside him. She carried a basket of wildflowers she'd gathered for the table. "My grandmother used to say the desert saves its beauty for those who wait." Over the past month since the trial, their life had settled into a rhythm of contentment neither had dared hope for. The community's acceptance, while not universal, had grown. Ayanna was now welcome at the trading post, where Thompson even special-ordered supplies she requested, herbs and dyes traditional to her people. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to ask her advice about medicines and weather signs. "Letter came today," Caleb said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "From the territorial government." Ayanna's hand stilled on his arm. Letters from the government rarely brought good news for her people, but Caleb was smiling as he opened it. "Remember when Judge Whitfield said he'd write to the governor about us? Well, seems he kept his word. They can't change the marriage law yet. That's federal, but they've issued a special recognition, a certificate of domestic partnership. They're calling it not marriage, but legal recognition that you have rights here. Property rights, inheritance rights." Ayanna took the paper with trembling hands. There was her name, written in official script, recognized by the territory of Arizona as a legal resident and partner. "I am official? As official as the territory can make you." Caleb's voice was thick with emotion. "It's not enough, not nearly, but it's a start." That afternoon, Tom Anderson arrived with his wagon loaded with lumber. Behind him came Miguel Martinez with tools, Sam Wheeler with hardware, and even Sheriff Coleman with a crew of men. "What's all this?" Caleb asked, bewildered. "Barn raising," Tom announced. "That old barn of yours is still showing damage from the fire. Community figured it was time to fix it proper. Besides," he glanced at Ayanna with a grin, "heard there might be cause for celebration soon." Word of the certificate had already spread. As the men worked on the barn, women arrived with food for a feast. Elena Martinez brought tamales. Mrs. Anderson, her prejudices now replaced with grudging respect, contributed her famous apple pies, and others brought dishes that soon covered improvised tables. As the sun began its descent, the new barn stood complete, straight and strong against the sky. Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church in town, a man who'd spoken against prejudice from his pulpit after the trial, approached Caleb and Ayanna. "I know it's not legal marriage," he said quietly, "but if you'd like, I could say some words, a blessing on your union, in the eyes of God, if not the law." Ayanna looked at Caleb, her eyes bright with unshed tears. They had talked about this, about how to honor their commitment when the law wouldn't recognize it. "We would be honored," Caleb said. As words spread through the gathering, people formed a rough circle. Not everyone. Some families made their excuses and left. But more stayed than went. In the golden light of sunset, with the new barn as backdrop and wildflowers everywhere, Pastor Williams spoke simple words about love transcending boundaries, about courage in the face of opposition, about two people choosing each other against all odds. Tom Anderson stood as witness for Caleb. Elena Martinez stood for Ayanna. When the pastor asked for the rings, Caleb produced two simple bands he'd had the blacksmith make from silver dollars, a symbol of how their journey had begun. "I cannot pronounce you man and wife in the eyes of the law," Pastor Williams said at the end, "but in the eyes of this community and the God who made us all, you are bound together. What God has joined, let no one tear apart." When Caleb kissed Ayanna, the cheer that went up was loud enough to send a flock of doves wheeling into the sky. Even crusty Sam Wheeler was seen wiping his eyes, though he blamed it on the dust. The celebration continued into the night. Fiddle music filled the air, and couples danced on the packed earth. Ayanna, who had never attended such a gathering as a welcomed guest, found herself whirled from partner to partner as the community celebrated not just a union, but a small victory over their own prejudices. Late in the evening, as things were winding down, Pete Williams approached. He had served 6 months of his sentence and been released early for good behavior. He stood awkwardly before them, hat in hand. "I came to apologize," he said simply, "and to thank you. Prison gave me time to think about what kind of man I want to be. You showed mercy when you could have pushed for worse for me. I won't forget that. People change," Ayanna said softly. "This is good." As the last guests departed, Caleb and Ayanna stood together in their new barn, marveling at what the day had brought. Where boards had been charred and broken, now fresh lumber stood strong. It seemed a perfect metaphor for their own journey. "My grandmother had a saying," Ayanna said, leaning into his embrace. "From ashes grow the strongest trees. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She would have liked you, I think, a man who sees worth where others see only $2. They walked back to the house, their house now, truly and legally. Hand in hand. The certificate might not be a marriage license, but it was recognition, acceptance, a foothold in a future they were building together. In the bedroom, Ayanna touched the silver ring on her finger, remembering another piece of silver, the $2 that had started everything. "They sold a worthless Navajo girl for $2, she whispered, echoing those long-ago words. "Yet you took me and loved me, Wild. And you took a broken man and made him whole," Caleb replied, drawing her close. "Worth more than all the silver in the territory." Outside, a coyote called to its mate across the desert, and the answer came back clear and true. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had watched over native peoples for thousands of years and newcomers for decades. Under their light, two people from different worlds had found each other and, against all odds, created something new. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. A young Navajo woman appeared at their door, travel-worn but smiling. Ayanna gasped in recognition. It was her cousin, daughter of the aunt she'd seen at the trading post months ago. "Grandmother sends word," the young woman said in Navajo. "She has heard of your new life. She says the path you walk is different from our people's way, but she sees your happiness. She sends blessings, and this." She handed Ayanna an intricately woven blanket in the traditional style, beautiful enough to take their breath away. Worked into the pattern were symbols of unity, strength, and new beginnings. "Tell grandmother," Ayanna said through her tears. "Tell her I have not forgotten who I am. I carry our people's knowledge here, and I share it. Tell her I am helping to build a bridge." After the cousin left with promises to return, Ayanna spread the blanket on their bed. It looked right there, a piece of her heritage blessing their future. In the days that followed, life settled into new rhythms. The certificate from the territory opened doors. Ayanna could now legally own property, sign contracts, conduct business. She began trading her traditional remedies and plant knowledge, building a small but steady income. Women from as far as Bitter Creek sought her out for help with difficult births or stubborn illnesses. Caleb expanded the ranch, able to buy cattle at better prices now that the drought had broken and grass was plentiful. The hidden water sources Ayanna had shown him gave them an advantage other ranchers envied but respected. On a warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains crimson, Ayanna placed Caleb's hand on her stomach. "The land is not the only thing that blooms after the rain," she said softly. Caleb's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You mean, by winter, there will be 3 of us here." The joy on his face was like sunrise after a long night. He pulled her close, laughing and crying at once. "A child, our child, a bridge child," Ayanna said, "born of 2 peoples, belonging to both." As if in celebration, a brief rain shower swept across the desert, just enough to release the scent of sage and wet earth. A rainbow formed in the east, arcing across the sky like a promise. They had started with a transaction of degradation, $2 for a human being deemed worthless. But from that dark beginning had grown something beautiful and strong. Love had taken root in unlikely soil, nurtured by courage and kindness, until it bloomed as bright as any desert flower. The frontier was changing, slowly but surely. In one small corner of it, a man and woman had proven that worth couldn't be measured in coins, that love could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the most precious things came from the most unlikely beginnings. As night fell over the desert, bringing its chorus of crickets and night birds, Caleb and Ayanna held each other close, their hands intertwined over the promise of new life. They had traveled far from that dusty market in Bitter Creek, through drought and violence, prejudice and pain, to arrive at this moment of quiet joy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did in this hard land. But tonight, they were complete. A man who had found love again, a woman who had found her worth, and a child who would inherit both courage and wisdom. The desert stars looked down on them, eternal witnesses to yet another story of human resilience and love's triumph over hate. And somewhere in the vast silence, the land itself seemed to whisper its approval for these two souls who had learned its lessons well, who understood that in the desert, as in life, the most beautiful blooms came after the harshest seasons. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West. If you've enjoyed this tale of love conquering prejudice in frontier America, please let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. I'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic stories of courage, romance, and redemption from America's frontier days. Share your thoughts about Caleb and Ayanna's journey in the comments. What touched your heart most about their story?